Thank you, Andy, and thank you everyone who's here. It looks like we're going to have some great sessions. I got the privilege of glancing ahead. So we have 3 talks today, and what we'll do is hear each of the talks. Maybe if we have time, ask 1 or 2 questions for each, and then have kind of a round robin, a discussion about stakeholder engagement at the end. So our first speaker is Meghna Barber-Sebens. She's from Oregon State University, and she is also on the leadership team of Engage and Fuse, so has some deep knowledge of what we're talking about. Her title is Framing a Decision Model for a Hyper-Localized Food, Energy, and Water Nexus in a Rural Community in India. Thank you, Meghna.
Oh, thank you so much. This is great. You can see you want to move. Yeah, there you go. So I also have just 2 slides, and I apologize. I did pack stuff in the 2 slides, but I wanted to sort of leave the slides also accessible to folks who may want to later on just get a good idea of what was going on in this project. So we had so my colleagues, I just want to acknowledge them, Jenna and Minu, Nagesh and Uma. So all of us actually had a project funded by an organization in India called Spark to work with some of the local farmers in southern India to look at adaptation planning for climate change, adaptation and mitigation of some of the water issues that they're facing. So our goal was to sort of take some of the things we had learned from our Infuse project and see if there were some ways, how applicable it was. Of course, there were other parts of the project too, but here I'm going to just focus on how we were trying to explore some of the lessons we had learned while working on the Umatilla River Basin community here in Oregon with the Infuse project, how some of those stakeholder issues may be different or similar while working with a small community in rural India. So when you're working with some of these communities across the world, one of the things we all find commonly is that many times we don't necessarily have data or monitoring infrastructure to understand what's going on in terms of how the water budgets are changing or how the hazards are affecting these communities. But many times what happens is that the communities have been living in these areas for such a long time that they have this built traditional ecological knowledge that sort of builds over centuries and it sort of informs their decision making. So one of the things we wanted to explore was that as part of the Infuse project, we had developed a tool called InterACTWEL, which is actually a planning template for trying to coordinate decision making in local watershed communities. But the goal was if you could use that template to try and do something similar here. So once you have the template, then you can identify things like what's the missing data, what kind of models need to be developed, what kind of decision support system you need to create to visualize some of the scenarios of adaptation planning. Here, the goal was sort of to try and see if we could work with the community that is under monitored, try to interact with the stakeholders to understand what is their long-term ecological knowledge that could be helpful in trying to frame a decision problem using the InterACTWEL platform and the InterACTWEL tool, so that they would have some sort of a template moving forward that they could use to try and manage or coordinate any kind of water management practices or cropping practices as the changes in the climate affected their availability of water and other kinds of stresses on the community. So that was like the big picture of what you were trying to do here. And in the picture over here, you see on the right-hand side, is basically things like the kinds of crops they grow. They're mostly paddy as well as groundnut. And now they've also started having mango trees as part of their crops. But as the climate shifts, they're sort of unsure how the croppings would have to be adjusted. And then one of the pictures on the left shows you a deep dry well that they used to previously use for drinking water as well as for irrigation. But now, as you can see, these are pretty dry and they are completely unusable. So there are some opportunities to try and adapt some of these wells or other kinds of rural practices to try and do some rainwater harvesting or do some sort of planning towards how do they make up for the dry periods as the dry periods become longer and as they shift over the years. So Kenzie, can you go to the next slide? So here, what I'm going to sort of show you a quick overview of what that project, basically what it involved and what kind of product it created, and some lessons we learned. So in the project, basically, we sort of worked for quite a while working with some of the farmers in the small community. It's a hamlet, or also called a panchayat in India, a small little village and neighboring villages that are part of a micro watershed. And we went through a wide range of engagement strategies like interviews, and we did some little bit of workshops with them. We also had some more and more like engaging some exercises for them to do some problem solving and brainstorming. We showed them all kinds of data and GIS information and sort of used those kinds of approaches to get the conversations going. So it was over a period of time of a few months. And then the information that we learned from them was then used to sort of create this map. So this little box diagram you see, and I don't expect you to actually read everything in this box diagram, but the idea of this box diagram is that we sort of use this template model from the InterACTWEL tool to try and create a conceptual planning model for this community. So the way it works is you sort of work with the community to identify what are the major stresses or perturbations that they are most interested in trying to manage. So for example, in this community, labor shortage and water shortage was one of the major stresses that they were trying to figure out solutions to. And one thing that we've explored was that, communities don't necessarily look at individual stress or individual perturbation. They are sometimes looking at multiple stresses. So for them, when you're looking at problem solving, you have to sort of think about all the relevant stresses that are necessary for this community to manage moving forward. So then sort of these green boxes, or the gray boxes with the green little boxes you see in them, these are essentially the socioeconomic systems that the community identified in terms of, at what scale do they think decisions will need to be taken in their community to manage droughts and manage the labor shortage problem. And so they sort of came up with this idea that, hey, we need to take some choices will have to be made at the hamlet scale or the micro watershed scale, where some choices will need to be made at the household scale. And then through the interview and the engagement process, we sort of identified what kind of actions they would be open to taking at the hamlet scale, and what kinds of, those are shown by these diamonds, the kinds of actions they would take. But then this box sort of explains, sort of delineates the different kinds of goals they may have or constraints they may be dealing with, both at the hamlet scale as well as the household scale. One of the other things that came out of this engagement was that, the farmers and the community members were able to identify what kinds of household actions would be independent of what the hamlet does, and what kind of household actions would actually depend on what actions are taken at the hamlet scale. So trying to map that through an engagement process to coordinate what would watershed scale planning approach look like was really helpful to sort of create that kind of map using a tool like this. And in the process, the farmers also sort of help us identify what kind of societal drivers would be important for the community, as well as what kind of national system they're sort of looking at that are important to consider moving forward when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to developing models, when it comes to decision making. So one thing I want to point out here is that these arrows that you see are sort of like loops of feedback loops, things that the farmers think that, okay, these systems are going to affect the decisions we take. And depending on the decisions we take, here's a feedback loop on how we think it'll affect the societal drivers or national systems. And it was also interesting to see how, similar to many studies, consensus was an important issue that rose again and again at different scale as one of the constraints, as well as one of the goals of the community. So quickly, two important lessons in the interest of time that I want to quickly highlight here is, one of the interesting things we learned about from this project was that when our premise was that because we don't have actual data to understand what's going on this side, if we can use the stakeholder ecological knowledge or the local knowledge to build this kind of a decision-making tool or platform or a model, then it would be helpful to sort of get a better representation of the region. But the farmers themselves sort of admitted that, hey, as the climate is changing, our generational or multi-generational beliefs and if then else tools that we've come up with are no longer valid and they're disrupting. So for example, things like, when will rain come? What kind of rain cycles do we expect? When should we plant? What should we plant? All of those ecological knowledge that they have sort of have been embedded in the community is getting disrupted as the climate changes. So when you take that ecological knowledge and to build a decision model like that, it's important to sort of understand that, hey, this model may be only, this model may need to be adapted as we go forward and as information, as the farmers' experiences change over time. And the other lesson that I want to quickly point out was that we learned was that having a template like this was really helpful to help us with not just understanding what kinds of decisions will need to be coordinated in this community, but also who are the stakeholders that are missing in this planning process. So, for example, when we were building our Hamlet model and then the household model, and what kind of actions they would take, many of the actions that were coming up were sometimes representative of certain kinds of groups of stakeholders that were not there in the room. For example, sometimes women farmers or farmers with lower caste or even farm day laborers, their actions were not represented, or there was some missing information or missing knowledge in the process that would require us to ask questions like, hey, so who would take this action? Or are there any communities who would take another kind of action? And that's how we sort of identified some additional missing stakeholders in our conversations. And that was really helpful because that allowed us to then come up with and adjust our stakeholder engagement approach to sort of try and reach out to those new stakeholders. But the good thing is that having a model template like this allowed us to build on this model in an iterative manner over time as new stakeholders were identified, so that we could sort of represent some of the missing actions and the missing decisions that would need to be coordinated in that community. So I'll just stop there with those two lessons and open to questions. Hopefully I didn't go too much over time, but anyway, since there are three of us, we should be hopefully okay. All right, thank you.
You did a great job, and it sounds like a really interesting system to get in there. Are there any quick clarifying questions at this point? Andy.
Yes, thanks so much, Meghna. That's really interesting to hear. So I was just curious, you mentioned developing and applying a flexible process in your model building, in particular to accommodate new stakeholders to represent missing knowledge as the process went. Were there specific challenges with working with both longer standing knowledge holders, stakeholders, and then new stakeholders coming in? Specific challenges and perhaps practices that you adopted? I mean, you mentioned the framework, and that having that framework was really helpful as a map. Would you like to kind of elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, in our initial conversations, the women farmers were not part of the conversation because, so when you go to a different community, which is not necessarily Western culture, there are so many cultures. I mean, you all have experiences while working in different countries and continents. The cultural setup can be very different in terms of how you reach out to these stakeholders. So one thing when we identified, for example, the women farmers were missing because their practices were also driven by slightly different goals. So for example, the women farmers were more interested in supporting their children. They were more focused about family support, whereas the males had a slightly different outlook towards the world. So their actions were more motivated in terms of how do I make sure I can, provide, some sort of sustenance for my family, that since I am, maybe there is a widow or some sort of situation like that where they don't necessarily have the support system that maybe, the male farmers would have. But they were sometimes not in the room. But when we identify that, all right, who would, for example, take an action, the action, for example, in this case, that I'm thinking of sharing with you guys is related to groundwater pumping. And so they were like, more eager to do additional groundwater pumping, but have some conservation practices in their farms along with it. So when they were looking at that issue, we were trying to find out who would do something like that. And during the conversation, it came up that, hey, there are some farmers and they turned out to be female. So we sort of invited, so what we decided, okay, they were not coming to the room to have a conversation because it was a male dominated type environment. So what we did was we sort of reached out to them separately through another woman, farmer who we had built a relationship with. We reached out to this group of women farmers And the way we adjusted our stakeholder approach was that we sort of created a separate meeting with them, had separate set of additional questions for them that would sort of help us identify some of their motivations, which were unique compared to some of the earlier open room discussions that we had when we first started. So we slightly adjusted the way we like the setup in terms of who was invited in the discussion when the women farmers were there. That was one thing. In terms of we said, okay, we'll just keep it all female, let the males have a break a little bit and just try to have an open conversation where they're comfortable to speak up. But then there were other issues, like for example, the farmers from the lower caste, even though they were there, it was hard to, we didn't have enough time to sort of start engaging them also. Like we knew what the actions were, but to engage them in the conversations, I think would have required a lot more time to build trust with them, to go and, have conversations where you become a familiar face. So it's a step-by-step process, but you definitely have to understand the cultural context of that group. And so when you bring in them as new stakeholders in your mapping, effort, one thing that we had to definitely do is that we had to adjust our questions themselves to ask additional questions that would be relevant to that group. And having someone who can be like the in-person or the person that that they have sort of confidence in or they have trust in was really helpful to break that ice with that smaller group or the new group. So yeah, those are the kinds of, I guess, does that help in some way clarify some of the issues, some examples?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. And just to give you a little insight, this is actually an ongoing effort. So one thing we want to go back is actually to go back and do some more monitoring and set up an instrumentation for them to put some weather stations, put some gauges, so that they can actually now start collecting their own data, because they're finding that their own if-then-else rules that were in their minds and through generations are no longer working. So is there a way for them to use data in combination to update their own rules?